Good morning. Good morning. Has it been a good conference for everybody? Yes. All right. Well, it's been a good conference for me too, and I've really been missing my good old mentor and buddy, Chuck Marsh. Any of y'all know Chuck? And so Chuck passed away just in September. It was really fast, pancreatic cancer, and really unexpected for all of us. But Chuck, I don't know if any of you were here at the dinner last year at the awards ceremony, and I think it was Roland who asked, will everybody stand up who has been at every single CFSA conference? And Chuck was the only person in the whole room who stood up. He had been at every single CFSA conference. So this is the first one he's not been at. And Chuck always liked to start talks off with poetry. So I'm going to read a poem to you in honor of our beloved Chuck Marsh. This is Rilke. I love the dark hours of my being. My mind deepens into them. There I can find, as in old letters, the days of my life already lived and held like a legend and understood. Then the knowing comes. I can open to another life that's wide and timeless. So I am sometimes like a tree, rustling over a grave site and making real the dream of the one its living roots embrace. A dream once lost among sorrows and songs. So we love you, Chuck. And my goal with this talk this morning, as well as with all activities, is to have it contain seeds that are actually planted forward in your lives after this, right? Not just to go through a big explosion of information, but for each of you ideally to go away with something that's actionable and even in some mild way or some large way transformative in your life and what you're doing. So I really want to invite you. I'm going to take just about a minute right now to just be silent and just to think about why you're here, why you're in this particular talk right now, what intentions you have, what you might want to learn. And then I'm going to take a few minutes to hear a little popcorn of that. I'm going to take notes and see if I can address in a roundabout or direct way some of what you're looking for. And then also maybe I'm bringing a few things that you don't even know to ask for that you'll take home after this. All right, so I'm just going to take a minute of quiet right now. So, anyone want to share anything?
How to encourage school systems to embrace permaculture. Work with youth teaching gardening and cooking, and I'm very interested in permaculture, passionate about it, but not sure how to get schools to recognize that might even be a more sustainable way to teach.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can say really quickly that in Asheville, there is a program with Vance Elementary School.
That's where I used to work.
Did you know Justin Holt?
Yeah.
Okay, so what they're doing there is amazing because they've created a whole permaculture landscape around the school that's designed for the teaching curriculum of the school. So they worked with the teachers, and that's funded by Roots Hummus. So it's also nice to get a successful organic food business funding you through a nonprofit foundation. All right, what else? Yeah.
I have an acre, and what I really want to learn is how to get out of nature's way. Let it help me save time and money and make things easier.
Yeah.
Because I understand that that's what permaculture is. Instead of fighting it, you work with it.
Yeah. And as to what that means, that's a very fascinating, squirrely study. Yeah.
You mentioned cisterns that you guys have built.
Ferro cement cisterns.
Yeah. There's time for that.
Just get with me about talking to Steve Kimball, who is a builder up in Asheville area who's built a lot of ferro cement cisterns. Steve Kimball, yeah. What else?
We just bought some property along the Blue Ridge Parkway.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of exploring the idea of an intentional community.
Have you been to visit Earth Haven?
Yes.
Cool. All right, that's one thing I would say is come back to Earth Haven, where I live, and we can do customized kind of class tours that address the actual founding processes of intentional communities. That's a really good reference point there. 22 years of successes and failures. All right, one more. Yeah.
So I haven't bought my own yet, but I'm looking to. So I guess things that I should and should not look for, keeping all of this in mind of what would and would not work to kind of avoid some pitfalls.
I do permaculture consulting, and a lot of people end up calling me after they've bought land. And it's like at that point, it's like, okay, all right, we're going to work with this land, but it's, it's really good to set goals ahead of time before purchasing land. A lot of people, you're familiar with a checklist. You make a checklist of all the qualities that you want in a piece of land. That's a little different, though, than establishing your goals, right? Goal articulation, which I'm going to talk more about in a little bit, but goal articulation at the beginning of a process is extremely important, especially to avoid what we call, permaculture terminology, type 1 errors. Type 1 error is those, though, that are so pivotal that you're going to spend the rest of the lifetime of the project putting energy into dealing with that mistake. Whereas type 2 errors are ones that are more minor. Even if it takes $10,000 to rectify, you can rectify it. Buying your land in the wrong place is a type 1 error. One pattern that I've seen with that is people not paying enough attention to our human relationships when we buy land and our proximity to family and really important friends and social networks. We get inspired by the idea of farming and land-based living, and we're young, and then we don't look at the whole arc of our lifespan and parents getting old and having kids and all the social aspects of that. And so then we get committed to a land project and we're not having social needs met and relational design in place. So that's a really important thing right at the beginning, to not make a type 1 error of buying land in the wrong place. All right. So I do all kinds of permaculture education. If you like this, I do much longer classes and everything. And School of Integrated Living, or SOIL, is the school I teach through. It's at Earth Haven Eco Village up near Asheville, which is where I live. And then Living Systems Design is my permaculture design and consulting business. So I help landowners to develop plans. And I've been doing all this for a while and everything, but I wanted to start off with my kind of origin story of getting involved in permaculture and in teaching, actually, because it's a cool little cultural story of how to create leadership, which is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face in a lot of land-based movement, is how to create the right kinds of leadership. So what this is this little cob outdoor kitchen and bread oven that I ended up building, or leading a class building along with my friend Candace Carr when I was a sophomore at UNC Asheville in 2002. We actually got tricked into this in a really wonderful way, which is there were these flyers up for this natural building class on the wall that was being run by Janelle Kapoor. Any of you know Janelle? Clayworks International, a really cool organization if you want to learn about natural building. Clayworks, spelled K-L-E-I-W-E-R-K-S. They got their experience when they helped this village in Thailand to rebuild their entire village, because it was one of the indigenous villages in the north, got relocated because of a government dam project that flooded their valley. And Clayworks went over and helped them to rebuild their entire village for 200 people out of natural buildings. And now it's based in Asheville. And so Janelle was doing a class in natural building, and my friend Candace and I both wanted to go, and we couldn't afford it. And Janelle said to us, okay, you can come, but what you have to do is, as soon as you're done with this class that you take from me, is 10-day intensive, you have to go run a class and then use the money from that class to pay me for the class you just took. And so what she did, it was brilliant. It enabled us to go. She still made a living as an educator, and she immediately catapulted us into leadership and teaching, even though I might not have done that, who knows, ever, but certainly not right then if she hadn't done it. And so this is what happened is this big storm had just come through Asheville. These freak tornadoes had come through and torn down warehouses down in the River Arts District of Asheville. And there were these warehouses with all these materials that had just been torn down, laying in ruins. And so we went and salvaged all the roofing material from those, and we made the adobe bricks out of sand and clay and straw, and did all this in a class and built the oven. And it's still standing. This is at Pearson Community Garden. So that was a big learning experience, and seeing how natural building is kind of a subtopic of permaculture, right? It's a vast and expansive and subtle topic. It's not just one thing. It's not gardening. It's not forest gardening. It's not natural building. It's not photovoltaics, but it includes all those things in integrative systems. And this is my introduction to it, was through the natural building lens, and then I kind of got into the wider picture. It was also a teaching for me in how permaculture is about culture and the invisible elements of the economics and relationships and mentorship, as much as it is about the physical techniques. And I'm going to keep on pounding on that theme. You know, many of you who are involved in farming and land-based projects, you know, you're already experiencing, right? It doesn't matter if you know physical techniques and even have the right tools if you don't have the right relationships and the right mentorship and the right social support and the right communication skills, all that kind of stuff, right? And so what we do in permaculture is try to explicitly integrate those things into systems. We call it invisible structures, right? The cultural, economic, social, invisible structures. So, you know, when I call this successful urban permaculture strategies, this class, the main key to success, in my opinion, is the invisible structures. It doesn't matter if you have the right seeds and the right techniques and all that stuff if you don't have the invisible social structuring going on underneath as part of the design. So, a creative cultural thing that we did, you can look it up online, Permaculture in Action. We have a YouTube video. Actually, what this was is we had done permaculture designs for landowners in the city of Asheville, and then we put together a work class where it was people who wanted to learn by implementing permaculture systems, building ponds and putting in poultry systems and gardens and forest gardens and mushroom systems and everything. And we got the landowners to pay into the class at a lower rate, the students to pay into the class at a lower rate, and then we all implemented it together. And it was really awesome. And so there's like an 8-minute documentary, Permaculture in Action, online about that. And we built this cob bench in that class at one property, and you can see it's so beautiful. It had this like lime-based plaster on the surface, and it had this was a major learning experience though, because then this is what happened when it rained with the exact wrong timing. We were really unlucky. What happened is right when the plaster was drying, it had lime in it, this heavy rainstorm came along, and each raindrop pocked the plaster and caused these little micro cracks. And then when it dried, it had the micro cracks, and the water got inside and then froze and expanded and cracked all the plaster off, and the whole thing fell apart. And so that was a specific learning around, if I build a cob bench again like that, I'm gonna put a roof over the top of it, which is actually what we had talked about doing anyway, and we chose not to because there wasn't the money for it. So we said, all right, we're gonna experiment with this bench style. What it also is another lesson in this idea of taking both successes and failures as really important pieces of the puzzle, right? And so I didn't say, oh my God, we failed, this is awful, everything's horrible. No, I said, oh, we learned a huge amount from this about plaster and about cob, and it was on a small enough scale that it wasn't catastrophic and no relationships were destroyed through it, right? So it's really important to build in, we say we like to have lots of small failures, lots of small mistakes. And we can make lots of small mistakes, and we truly learn a lot from each one of those so that as we scale things up, we can get more and more sophisticated and succeed when it's at a scale that it really matters, right? So that's what we did in this. And then, so one of the things I learned from that was what led to this idea. This is actually at my mom's property in West Asheville, and this is a solution to a problem that maybe many of you have faced in very small scale gardening operations, which is when you're building raised beds, right? What do you make the edges of the raised beds out of, right? And so rot-resistant wood or dry stack stone. Well, dry stack stone is really expensive and it gets blasted out of mountainsides, and wood, even black locust milled wood only, is gonna last 10 or 15 years if it's in direct contact with soil, and it's very expensive, right? And so what I came up with here is what's called a stabilized cob retaining wall. Stabilized in masonry terms means putting in a small percentage of cement into something. And in this case, what we ended up landing on was a 14% white Portland mix in with this cob mix, 14% by volume. So what's white Portland? Well, Portland cement is what makes cement stick together. It causes a chemical reaction. It's autoclaved lime, hydrated lime, that has been cooked in a kiln to make it more chemically reactive. So most of the cement, when you buy it, it's gray. And why is it gray? Because it has the ashes from coal burning power plants in it, right? That's where they put, one of the places they put ashes from coal burning power plants also into sheetrock. And that stuff is full of heavy metals. So I did the research and I was like, oh, I don't want to use gray Portland cement with heavy metals in my garden beds, but you can use white Portland cement, which doesn't have the stuff from coal burning power plants in it. It's a little bit more expensive. So then what we did is we actually just the process is not visible here, but these walls ended up being about 5 inches thick, these walls of these raised beds. And we dug a 4-inch trench down into the ground around the perimeter of the beds, and then made forms with cardboard and bamboo stakes. Just harvested bamboo from the local invasive bamboo patch, sharpened them, drove them in, and folded cardboard down so it made a big U-shaped form. And then we made a rather wet mix of cob with the cement in it, put that down into the form and gently tamped it down, let that settle for about 2 hours, and then pulled the cardboard off, and we had these walls, and then just touched them up with a trowel a little bit. Many of you have probably heard one of the kind of principles of permaculture, there are a bunch of them, but is for each element to have multiple functions, right? Each element to have multiple functions. So the primary function of this wall is as a retaining wall for a raised bed, but I actually discovered other multiple functions for it after building it that I hadn't anticipated. One of them that I realized is that if you have Portland cement in your cob, then every time it rains with our slightly acidic rain around here, it's leaching a little bit of that into the soil, meaning it's actually putting calcium into your garden soil. So as this wall degrades, it's a slow release lime fertilizer into the soil. That was a nice thing. I was like, cool. So even serving a function as it degrades. You all know what thermal mass is? Right, it's a dense material like cob or stone or water that holds a lot of heat in the molecular bonds of the substance. And so if cob gets sun on it during the day, say in the winter, then it radiates that heat back slowly out at night and creates a microclimate around that keeps the soil warmer and actually causes plants to start growing sooner in the spring and buys you another couple weeks at the end of the season of season extension as well. Yeah.
When did you build this, and how long do you think it would last?
Yeah.
I'm thinking like school gardens and.
Yeah, this was built in 2011, so it's 6 years old now.
And is it still?
Yeah, well, we did different mixes. Like it was part of this was to make lots of mistakes and learn from it, and so I did different mixes all the way around. And this section right here is the one with the 14%, and that one is totally intact, except where there have been like physical damage from a tool hitting it.
Okay.
But it's totally intact in terms of rain. Yeah.
Would you, if you made a thicker cob and built it up by hand, would that work? I mean, I'm just curious, like, if I was too lazy to do the cardboard, would
The
it?
question, if everybody here is, could you make a thicker cob wall and build it by hand? You could, but actually I was too lazy, and that's why I did it this way. This was actually way faster than it would be to build it up by hand and use less material. And if you're buying cement, which is a mined, energy-intensive material and is expensive, I was trying to like really carefully use materials in this. That was actually the reason why I created the form idea, was because there's no way you could build a wall that thin by hand, that thin and tall, right? It'll just keep splooging out as you go. So this is actually a way of keeping a consistently thin wall, getting it high and stable, and using less materials.
Is it cheaper than using wood? Like than using cedar?
Then using cedar, I would say, I haven't done that exact calculation, but my guess is that it would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was 14%,
White Portland cement.
and nothing else in it, just the water and the cement.
So cob is a building material. It's a British name for a building material that is used around the world in a lot of places. Adobe is when cob is essentially made into bricks. It's a mixture of sand, clay, and some fiber, like straw or cow manure or horse manure. A lot of different animal manures are used that have fiber in them from the plants they've been eating. But it's essentially sand, clay, and a fiber makes what's called cob.
So you buy the cob or you create it yourself?
Create it, yeah. You can get sand out of a creek or buy it at a cement supply place. In this case, this clay was dug from a pond 20 feet from there that we were digging. Anyway, we dug the subsoil out and used that to make the beds. And then the fiber, use whatever fiber is bioregionally available. I've done actually kudzu cob. Kudzu makes a great cob. If you dry the vines down, and then you can chop them with a machete at the most primitive, or you can run them through a lawnmower, run a lawnmower over them to chop them up and get them down into like 2 to 4 inch lengths, and then you have kudzu cob. Yeah.
How did you address draining excess water from the bed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought that through and ended up deciding not to do anything about it, because the topography that this whole thing is on is not very flat. It's actually lower over here, so that's why that wall is higher. So we dug underlaying trenches for it, and I put a little bit of like broken up urbanite in there, broken up cement that had been in the ground from this being an urban waste dump previously. It was like crushed gravel kind of stuff in there. And so what I think is happening is that the water is draining out of the bed down to the low point here and then kind of percolating down this hill below there. If you were in a flatter area, I think it would make sense to explicitly put some pipes in it at the very base. But it's also a raised bed that's intending to retain water. And if you've got high organic matter soil in there and a lot of it, then it should be able to do a pretty good job at holding that water in the structure of the soil itself. Yeah, good question though. All right.
So did you dry the bamboo before you put it in as stakes?
No.
Because I've heard of bamboo like re-sprouting if you hammer it in.
It was only in there for a day. Yeah, it was just use round poles just to hold the cardboard up for a minute.
It's like rebar in the wall.
Now, I have done that too, but I split it for that purpose.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah, you can use split bamboo at like rebar in a cob wall to create a macroscopic fibrous structure to tie together the structural integrity of the wall. That's a really good practice, actually. You can do like a primitive earth bag building with that too, instead of using barbed wire. This is just an example. I was kind of like bringing us in from the origin story of how I got into all this and kind of how it evolved, right? And how this is, and you start to see the interface of building techniques with gardening in this case, right, of the cob raised bed. This is a solution that came from me having experience of natural building, and then it emerged off into gardening. This is one of the many types of examples we're going to get into of the interconnectedness of elements in a permaculture system, how we really try to integrate. It's all about the connections between elements. And here's another example, by the way, that's visible right there. You can't quite see it, and I'll show it in a later slide, but this is this house that my mom bought. It had just been built. It was like this prefab kind of house in this row of houses, and they had the heat pump on the southwest side of the building, right? Because in conventional building, people don't pay any attention to the sun. The other thing, this entire wall is the southeast facing wall of the house. There's literally no window on the southeast facing side. Any of you who have studied Passive building, where do you put the most windows? On the southeast side of the building, so you get sun in the morning, in the winter, and it heats the building up when you need it the most, right? So this building, no windows on the southeast side, and then the heat pump on the southwest side. So how does a heat pump work? It concentrates heat from either the outside to push the heat inside to heat the building, or it concentrates heat from the inside of the building and pushes it out to cool the building. So if you're trying to push heat into a place that's hot already, then you are exerting a lot more energy to do that. So in the summer, the heat pump here is roasting in the afternoon summer sun while the heat pump is trying to push heat from the inside of the house out to the outside. So it takes a lot of energy to cool the house, right? That's not good design. But we tried to design for that and actually work even with the heat pump system by creating this hoop house. This is actually bamboo, split bamboo. I use bamboo for a lot of things. By the way, it makes the very best biochar. If any of y'all are making biochar, bamboo is the best biochar. There are other applications of charcoal that other types of woods make the best charcoal for, but bamboo has a lot of pore density, which is what you're going for with biochar. So the more pores, the more nutrients and water the charcoal can hold. So bamboo has a lot of those pores, and it creates a lot of crenellation and empty space in there that holds nutrients and water. So anyway, this is split bamboo, and we just created this hoop house up against the side of the house attached to a long runner going along horizontally on the building that encloses the hoop house, right? Put plastic over that in the winter, so that becomes a little seed-starting warm house in the winter. My mom's bedroom window is just around that corner there, so she can open the window of her bedroom and let heat in from the hoop house into the house, so it's actually helping to heat her house. And then it's also creating a warmer environment around the heat pump. The heat pump is inside that little hoop house, so that then the heat pump is drawing heat from a warmer microclimate into the house, reducing the amount of electricity needed to heat the building, right? Just working with that system, kind of retrofitting. And then in the summer, we just pull the plastic off and grow beans up that little bamboo trellis and get shade over the heat pump that way, so that it's actually creating a cool microclimate around the heat pump and allowing the heat pump to use less electricity pumping heat out of the house to cool the house, right? So just a little simple use of bamboo and plastic to work with that existing infrastructure. And that's what we're doing in cities in a lot of cases, right? It's all retrofit. In a lot of cases, we're dealing with centuries of poor design layered on top of each other, unfortunately. And that's the reality. Like, we're not going to tear down hundreds of millions of dollars worth of buildings in a city and rebuild them. That doesn't make any sense either. It's all retrofit. It's doing the best we can with what we have, so we have to get clever about that. That's just a little 120-gallon tank that's going to actually, it's going around the other corner of the house, and we're working on building a ferrous cement cistern up here at the high point of the property. Another little trick while we're talking about that, actually, so cisterns don't have to be right next to a house to get the water to them passively. This is a counterintuitive thing, but if you have a sealed downspout, you can take water down the downspout through the ground up into the top of a standing cistern, as long as the high point of that cistern is below the entry point of the gutter, and as long as the pipe is sealed from air. Most guttering systems are not sealed from air, but that's the distinction. But if you do PVC or copper pipe that's soldered or something like that, and no air can get in, that acts as a siphon, so water finds its lowest level, and if it falls in there, it actually go down and up and fill the cistern up over here, allowing you to have the cistern at a higher point in the landscape. In this case, this spot over here is just about 18 inches higher, but that matters in a small urban landscape. That much difference in drop can give you better pressure for drip irrigation and just filling buckets up quicker. So that's a really great trick, is to be able to get water to where you want it. It doesn't have to be right up against the house. So why permaculture? There's a lot on this slide, a lot of content. We could talk about this for 3 hours, actually, but we're not going to, don't worry. But one of the main things about it is that permaculture is an ethically based design system. And this is a distinction between permaculture and, say, traditional landscape architecture or a lot of other design systems, computer software design, for instance. Most design systems are articulated just as how to do something in the most efficient way. It's a mechanistic process, how to do something in the most efficient way. Permaculture is explicitly founded as an ethically based design system. It's not enough to know how to do stuff, it's why do we do stuff? What are we trying to take care of? And the ethics of permaculture are articulated as caring for earth, caring for people, and sharing surplus. So in other words, that gives us an ethical basis for looking at a project and saying, is this project actually going to take care of earth and take care of the people involved and create surplus that can be shared? If it's not going to do that, I actually don't call that permaculture, even if it's using all of the gizmos. Or how do you redesign that project to be ethical, right? So this gives us a much different basis for taking on projects and endeavors, because it gives us a selection process and guides us in a direction of a cooperative culture where we're actually not putting energy into systems unless they're taking care of earth and taking care of people. So that's a really important distinction. And then it presents us with a deep vision of long-term cultural transformation. So permaculture, here we are at this wonderful sustainable agriculture conference. And permaculture, actually one of the founders of CFSA, Tony Cleese, was a student with Chuck Marsh and is a permaculturalist and is not here this time. But he started this conference and this organization, I know, with that kind of vision. But it's possible, and it's happening actually all over the planet, to have sustainable agriculture that is not, in fact, part of a vision of long-term cultural transformation, that is being taken over, co-opted by giant companies who just see a marketing opportunity. Right? That's what's happening in California a lot with large-scale organic farming. That's not a vision of long-term cultural transformation. That's the same old thing. Actually, it's a lot of the big ag companies that have existed for a long time that own the big organic companies, right? So those things are just perpetuating the same dynamics of resource exploitation, but under a different brand. Permaculture is saying, no, we have to actually see our land use patterns as part of a long-term vision of cooperative culture and ethically based living, and design from that front rather than just how do we do stuff. And so Chuck called it a design system for the creation of regenerative human habitats. That's pretty good. And regenerative is a great word that is coined to distinguish between regenerative and sustainability. Sustainable is a word defined as something is sustainable if it doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's what the United Nations means by sustainability. Regenerative systems are those that actually are making better conditions for future generations. That's our goal, is to leave pleasant surprises, not to just barely leave things so that future generations can kind of scrap it together, but to actually leave richer topsoil in literal and metaphorical ways for future generations. That's regenerative as compared to sustainable. And then the propagation of diverse ecocultural life ways through a combination of biomimicry and a constructive attitude towards chaos. I like that because I said it. And permaculture derives its insights from the patterns of natural ecosystems. I'm going to talk more about that in detail in a second, and from the patterns of truly sustainable human cultures. So the folks who founded permaculture, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, they didn't create it out of thin air. They did a big research project where they looked at hundreds of indigenous cultures around the planet and asked the question, how have people lived in ways that have not destroyed their landscapes? Because there are plenty of examples of people who have destroyed their landscapes and their civilizations. Any of you all read Collapse by Jared Diamond? Yeah. If you want the evidence of that, if you think that anyone's making it up, read Collapse by Jared Diamond, who's a deep anthropologist and works with archaeological records, and in there tells the story of 5 different civilizations over the last 5,500 years that have collapsed specifically because of topsoil loss, including the Roman Empire. And he creates a checklist of qualities to allow you to predict a civilization that's on its way to collapse. And our culture meets all of them. Yeah. So deeper results than organic gardening alone. So talking about the natural patterns, just to go into this for a second, and the idea that permaculture gets all of our best ideas from natural ecosystem patterns. Now, what does that mean? Y'all read Biomimicry by Janine Benyus? That's a really great book if you want to have your mind blown. Even though she wrote it back in the 90s, it's still pretty cutting edge. What she does in that book is look at how people are applying insights from specific organisms, the mechanisms of how specific organisms do things, like how is it that oysters make glue at room temperature in the ocean to attach themselves to rocks with a glue that's more powerful than anything that's manufactured with toxic chemicals in factories. And they have this amazing way of doing it with enzymes and hydrogen and carbon and oxygen. And so there are people studying how they do that. The whole book is going through all these amazing things that organisms do and learning from them how to do that. And so that's biomimicry. That's mimicking specific mechanisms from nature, from natural organisms. And I like to do what we call eco-mimicry. And eco-mimicry, really, that was in my definition of permaculture, right? It's like eco-mimicry is mimicking the way ecosystems work. So it's not just organisms, but what are the dynamics of ecosystems? And we'll talk more about what we mean by that. So getting into a natural pattern, we ask things as basic as, why do trees branch, emerge in a branching pattern? What's that doing for the tree? Maximize the leaf surface area with minimum wood, right? It allows it to get as much photosynthetic area out there while using as little wood as it can, because wood is an expensive material to make, energetically speaking, using sugars, right? If you put a wall and a wind hits a wall, the wind just pushes against that wall. If it's too tight, right, then it doesn't have any airspace to break the wind up into tiny little sub-winds. And so that creates a lot of resistance, and objects get blown over when they're set up like that. But with a tree, with a branching pattern, it disperses the wind, exactly. And while it's doing that, by the way, what does all that surface area do? The branching pattern catches water as dew, right? Because how does dew work? When moist air is warm and there's a cold surface, the water condenses onto the cold surface. That's how dew works, right? There are human beings in the world who survive entirely on dew. For desert people, you can collect dew on waxed animal skins at dawn and sunset when the temperatures are changing, and funnel that dew down and drink that and survive that way with no rain for months, just on the dew, right? So on twigs on a tree, if you have more surface area, then that creates more surface area for dew to condense onto the tree and then make its way down towards the root system of the tree. And also, it's not just water, because what else is in air is dust. And what is dust? Nutrients. So this is actually a significant source of nutrients for plants, is condensing the water along with the nutrients held in water droplets out of the air and gathering that. Now, what else is happening is in the other direction, and there are all these studies now about how trees create rain. Trees create rain. And why is that? Rain actually requires seed. And it turns out that right, for water droplets to condense out of the air, they have to have something to condense around. And that ends up being dust. It also, and this is the most fascinating, it turns out to be microbes. And there's a whole ecosystem of microbes that live up on the canopies of trees and are getting kicked up because the branches and the branching pattern is waving and kicking dust and microbes up into the air and seeding rain and causing rain to begin. And then once it begins, it's a precipitation, it's a cyclic process, and some raindrops cause more raindrops to precipitate. So trees actually help to create rain through the branching pattern. And now going to this concentration of nutrients one, so the branching pattern is also about when they photosynthesize, they're making sugars in the leaves, then those condense down to the twigs, the sugar condenses down to the twigs, then to the limbs, then to the trunk, and then down into the roots, where then it uses another branching pattern to spread the sugars out through the roots, from the big roots to the smaller roots to the smaller roots, right? And then the roots are doing the same thing. They're using a branching pattern to gather minerals and water from the soil and concentrate it to increasingly large roots and then up into the trunk to cause photosynthesis to happen in the leaves and the canopy. And definitely working with the fungi, who are more of a net pattern themselves than a branching pattern. But yeah, so branching patterns allow organisms to spread things out and to gather things in. Well, let's go back to the roots for a second. Like when I was saying the roots, are in a branching pattern. Well, do trees grow in homogeneous soil in reality in most places? No, right? And actually, if you look at the root systems of trees in forests, which are non-human influenced soil, right? Then what they're doing is the tree is seeking out pockets of loose organic matter and of nutrient-rich pockets, and it uses the branching pattern to explore for different areas, and then it sends more energy into the root sections where it finds good soil and less into the root sections where it finds less good soil. So a branching pattern is used for exploring many different options and then having the flexibility to put more growth into the areas that are successful. See what I'm saying? Wow, so we just learned a lot from a branching pattern of a tree, right? And asking the question, why does a tree branch? And so the point I'm making here, this is an example of what we're doing in permaculture, which is whenever we see natural patterns in an organism or in an ecosystem, we don't just replicate that pattern kind of aesthetically. It's not about saying, oh, spirals are pretty, or a sunflower head is pretty, let's make our garden shaped like a sunflower seed head. By the way, a mandala is actually not a very practical shape for a garden, and lots of path space, not much bed space, not easy to get wheelbarrows through. It's not actually a great shape to organize a garden in. We look at those natural patterns and we say, why is an organism organized in that pattern? And we try to ask this kind of question, and then once we get that kind of insight, then we can apply that in a real way, in a functional way, to our human system. Here's just other examples of branching patterns in all kinds of biological forms, and here it is, right, in a stream network. This would be a mountain ridge up here, and these are springs popping out of the mountain, and then they concentrate down to the larger creeks, which concentrate down to the larger creek, down to the river, which goes down to the estuary, right, where it meets the ocean, or down to another bigger river. And so this is concentrating together like we're talking, right? But then, you know how I was talking about how trees pull nutrients and water up from the root system and then spread it out. What is happening analogously in a river system to that tree branching in terms of nutrients going this way? Like, it's easy to imagine stuff draining down, but what's going back up? What do salmon do? They swim upstream to spawn, right? And then they die up there. But before that, they've been down in the ocean eating all of this nutrient-rich food on the ocean bottom, because normally what's happening in a landscape is that over time, nutrients are washing out of the soils down river systems and concentrating in estuaries, water-soluble forms of nutrients, like including some forms of phosphorus, which is why up in the mountains where I live, especially there's very low phosphorus levels in the soil, because the soils are very old. They've had hundreds of millions of years for the phosphorus to wash out of the soil, right? So there's almost no phosphorus present there. It's very, very scarce, and it prevents plant productivity. So that's concentrating down here. Or ecosystems have to have a way to get nutrients back onto land in order to stay fertile in the long run, right? So how have ecosystems solved that? With salmon in the Northwest because salmon go down to the river, eat all that nutrient-rich food, including with phosphorus, and then swim back up through this branching pattern and redistribute nutrients. They get eaten by bears and people and birds and cycled back onto the land, bringing nutrients back onto the land, right? And there actually were East Coast salmon also. Here it was the passenger pigeon that played more of a role of that than the salmon in the southeast, but salmon did it in the northwest especially. And then see even a larger visible branching pattern of creeks and rivers. So then we say, all right, how do we apply these insights to human systems? We already said, so right, it's creating different sizes of paths from different orders with efficient use of materials, just like you want to use as little wood to support those leaves as you can, right? You want to use as little pathway space as you can to support as many beds as possible. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. Telephone trees, that's old school. We still have a telephone tree set up at Earth Haven though, right? It's an emergency thing. So it's like if you have an emergency, I don't have to call 50 people. I call 2 people, they each call 2 people, those people each call 2 people, right? And you spread out through a branching pattern to access all those people quickly. So it's getting information out, just like the tree uses branching pattern to get sugars out. Genetic evolution is in fact a branching pattern, if we observe it like that. And so also is plant breeding, right? Which is us mimicking genetic evolution and influencing it. And then organizing information for retrieval, like a folder system, right, on your computer. That's actually a branching pattern. You go into one folder, there are 5 folders in there. You go into one of those, there are 5 folders in that one. That's a branching pattern. So what branching does is it gives you a clearly definable pathway to find a certain piece of information. If you just have a big pool of folders, maybe some of you have this on your desktop, right? If you just have a big pool of folders, it's actually hard to find what you're looking for. But if you have a branching pattern, it makes it easy to find what you're looking for because there's a pathway to it. And here's a garden bed system using branching patterns, right? These are the twigs of the tree, and these are the leaves. See what I'm saying? The pathways are the twigs, and the beds are the leaves, right? You see a lot of people have a garden perimeter fence with these rectangular garden beds in there surrounded by pathway space. So that's minimizing growing space and maximizing path space. And paths are a place where weeds get established and then get into your beds from. They're a place you have to maintain that aren't providing a yield. So this is actually a way of minimizing pathway space, maximizing planting space. It's a modify what we call keyhole gardening, right? And then another thing I do in my gardens is I then put the fence line, the beds go right up to the fence, and I'll have a 4 to 6 foot tall, or in my current place at 8 foot tall deer fence on there, and that then serves as a trellis because now you've got your bed right up to the fence. So now you've got a giant perimeter trellis for growing beans and peas and cucumbers and Malabar spinach and all that. This looks like wood. This is not something I did actually. This is a picture I pulled offline, so I'm not sure what that is. I think it's wood though. It looks like split wood driven in.
No, I meant the arches.
Oh, that could be heated and bent bamboo. Yeah. Here's another application of branching. This is in Australia. This is another one of those things that we could talk for 3 hours about, but this is keyline irrigation. Keyline is a deep concept that was articulated by someone named P.A. Yeoman, Y-E-O-M-A-N, who is an Australian farmer who has influenced a lot, has a very strong influence in permaculture and especially broadacre, large-scale permaculture. You can see here these lines are they look like they're on contour. What does on contour mean? Right. Yeah, exactly. On the elevations, on the topographic lines, like on a hiking map, those are the contour lines. A contour line is level. If you walk along a contour line, you're never going up or downhill, right? So what the keyline insight is a slight modification of contour lines where he had the insight that at these dips, these drainages in the landscape, what's happening is during a rain event, you're ending up with a lot more water concentrated in here. It's too wet. And then out here, it's dry, right? And so he said, I wonder if there's a passive way we could get water from where it's too wet to where it's dry. And what he discovered is, oh yeah, if we do some type of water diverting structure on contour, but then tuck it up a little bit. So what do I mean by tuck it up? Well, if you followed this line, the actual level point would be like there. This would go like that and then like that. But instead, they tucked that up. So this point is now slightly higher than contour. So as water is draining down this draw, it hits this and then actually drains out towards the ridges. It's a subtle concept, and it's okay if you don't get it right now, but look it up and think about it. And what this does is it passively gets water out from the drainage, where it would be too wet, out to here just by using the cleverness of understanding how gravity works. So this point might be 5 feet vertically higher than this point, even though it looks like it's down in that draw. So what these are is living, contoured, and key-lined trees that have been planted. And what I do is if I'm restoring a pasture or some other degraded landscape like that that's not forested, is plant trees at tight spacing, 6 to 8 foot spacing even, on the contour, bump it up at the key, what's called the key point, which is that point that needs to be bumped up to make it slightly higher. And then I build logs and debris up against the uphill side of the trunks of those trees, so they become berms, which then as water hits those berms during a rain event, it diverts the water and spreads it out. And which, by the way, some of the useful tree species for doing that are black locust, which you can also get really cheap from the North Carolina Forest Service for 40 cents a pop for bare root trees, mulberry, honey locust. Those are 3 of the best candidates for living posts for erosion prevention. Yeah, one of the most useful things you can ever do in your landscape is to go out in it when it's raining really hard and to watch where the rain's flowing, but not just to watch it, film it and use flags to mark the edges of where water puddles and where there are concentrated flow points, because then you can go back when it's dry and you can point it out to other people for design conversations, and you can really dial it in to design your planting systems to deal with that water flow. So that's a really valuable thing, is to go out when it's raining really hard. So the reason this is an example of a branching pattern is that from the perspective of water, of irrigation, you can pipe water in, say from the settlement over here, in to this central area, and then let it, if you're doing flood irrigation, let it flow, branch out, and distribute from that point out towards those towards those arms of the contoured branches, because that middle point is higher than those outward branches. So I'm going to move on from that. I apologize if the example didn't get through, but maybe you can come and talk to me about it afterwards. And just look up Yeoman and McKeeline. So spiraling in more on permaculture and kind of why permaculture, this is this really awesome study that the UN commissioned that came out in March 2011 that was asking the question, how are we going to feed the world in the year 2100? Which is a great question. And what the study, which looked at agricultural practices in 57 nations, found is that small-scale agro-ecological farming, which is a mouthful, but is basically permaculture, is what the UN decided is going to feed the world in the year 2100. And they were explicitly comparing it to so-called green revolution industrial farming, using tractors and chemicals and petroleum-based fertilizers and all that. And they found that the big claim of the Green Revolution, right, is that this is the only way we can possibly feed all the people is through tractor farming with chemicals. This study showed that not only do all those tractor farming and chemical farming have all kinds of awful side effects, but that it actually doesn't even grow more food. That small-scale agro-ecological farming systems that are energy intensive, labor intensive, I should say, can grow up to 80% more food per acre without even using petroleum-based nitrogen fertilizers. And so small-scale agro-ecological farming, they gave examples in the study of the kind of thing they're talking about. And this stuff is straight like you're looking at a permaculture book, right? So people were using ducks to eat slugs out of their fields. And ducks are famous for that, for being insect predators in general, but especially slugs. People do this in the rice paddies in Asia a lot, using ducks to eat slugs out of the field. Using mulberry trees to feed chickens, right? This is an ancient, especially in China, practice. They have this beautiful whole carp pond system where they'll have a pond at a high point in the landscape, and they raise up to 7 different species of fish in the pond who all eat actually each other's waste or other things that are going into the pond. and they ring the pond with mulberry trees. And so then the people are harvesting the mulberries, the excess mulberries are dropping onto the ground outside the pond where chickens are eating it, or into the pond where they're feeding the fish. And then they drain the pond twice a year to harvest all the carp at once. And when they drain that pond, where do you think they put all that nutrient-rich water? Into the rice paddy, right? So it's a whole integrated system that includes woody plants, animals, and fish, and annual crops, all in an integrated system. And mulberries are an ancient part of that. They're particularly beneficial for poultry because the seeds have omega fatty acids in them, 6s and 9s. And so they make really high quality egg yolks and high quality chicken meat. And this is an old pattern, is feeding mulberries to chickens wherever both species exist. So in China it's big, and we learn from that and put mulberry trees in systems where they can feed ducks and chickens and other poultry, as well as people, not to mention raising silkworms. And then interplanting of crops, right? So this is another feature of a lot of these small-scale agro-ecological farming systems is interplanting of crops. And many of you, have heard of what we call in the kind of European-based organic movement, three sisters, right? Corn, beans, and squash, which is actually from the old milpa system, which is the Central American, Southern Mexican polyculture that has way more than just 3 plants in it. It has up to about 20 annual plants growing around corn, beans, and squash in clearings in the forest that are rotated through the forest on a long-term cycle, including the intentional making of charcoal when they clear forest sections. But interplanting of crops is not something just from the Americas. It's also even in what we call the Middle East and Southern Europe, when barley and wheat were originating, that whole time period, right, the Fertile Crescent, they were not grown as monocrops, right? Lentils, of course, are a legume that were often grown with barley and then later grown with millet. So this is actually a interplanting there as well. And they planted different things in the wet and the dry season to fill in the same spaces, right, that were all food crops. So interplanting is an old thing because, again, our ancestors were looking at how plants grow together and benefit each other, and plants rarely grow alone in monocrops. So this is a pattern that they found in the UN study. Using pigs for clearing, right? This is actually something that a lot of Appalachian folk are familiar with, is because if you leave a pig in one spot for too long, it's going to clear it, whether you want it or not, right? It's going to compact the soil and kill all the plants there, basically, because pigs will dig around the root system of a tree to get the grubs out that are living around the roots, and they'll pull the roots up and eventually push over even up to like a 6-inch diameter tree, right? So pigs are like tractors, except that I've never met tractors that reproduce. So they're used in that way a lot throughout the world at this point. And then this is one actually that I had never encountered in permaculture circles, was using carnivorous plants for pest control. That was a cool one. Carnivorous plants for pest control. So I started thinking about that more. Right when I was reading the study, it was when the spotted wing fruit fly, the spotted wing Drosophila, was coming into this region. Any of y'all dealt with that issue? Right? It's a non-native fruit fly species that, unlike most fruit flies, which wait for the fruit to ripen and drop to the ground, and then they go lay their eggs in it, the spotted wing fruit fly has a serrated ovipositor. It's a saw on its butt, and it comes and saws a hole in your unripe blueberries or raspberries on the plant and causes them to abort and drop, and then the eggs hatch out. And it really sucks. In fact, it's forcing a lot of raspberry farmers out of business in North Carolina. So I was looking into the carnivorous plants after that. I was like, oh, the sundews. Any of y'all know the sundew plants? You know, those beautiful little plants? They're actually specifically co-evolved with fruit flies. They make all these little drops of sugar on the leaves that attract fruit flies specifically, and then catch them and digest them and eat them. And so I was like, wow, I wonder if we could actually use sundews embedded in landscapes of thin-skinned fruiting plants, because that's what the spotted wing fruit fly gets, is the thin skin one. It can't get through a muscadine skin, by the way, so muscadines are safe from the spotted wing fruit fly. So yeah, so these are some of the examples of eco-mimicry in the UN study, and this is just a really important point for me. When I read this, it kind of corroborated what I had been thinking for a long time, but it gave us evidence that, all right, large scale and even mid-scale organic farming, the way we've done it in the US organic farming movement with tractors and tilling and monocropping and stuff, it's better than conventional, so-called conventional farming, post-World War II farming, but it's really not going to feed the world. It's really not going to meet all the goals we need it to. And there's been a trend, and this is controversial what I'm saying, and here we are at an organic farming conference, so there are plenty of people, probably people in this room who farm larger scale with tractors and stuff, and I'm not trying to demonize anybody or anything like that, but what I am saying is I think that there are underlying dynamics in the conventional organic farming movement that make it not a long-term successful strategy for producing food or responding to climate change, especially. That to respond to climate change and to produce food without a big chemical industry backing the whole thing up, we're gonna have to have labor-intensive small-scale systems. And by the way, they define small-scale as 2 to 5 hectares, right? Hectare is about 2.5 acres. So that's, you can do the math there, 4 to 10 acres or so. That was what they called small scale. That's bigger scale than I farm on, actually. But it's smaller scale than a lot of people do with tractors, right? And why is it that people are not currently farming in small scale agroecological farming methods all around the planet still? Just put that question out there for a second.
Lack of knowledge?
Lack of land.
Well, yeah, lack of, that's true. Certainly a lot of, especially native people, have been explicitly kicked off their land. Lack of knowledge in some cases, yeah, it's deeply ironic and tragic because most of this knowledge in permaculture came from land-based peoples, many different land-based peoples who had many centuries old traditional practices that were truly sustainable or regenerative. And then they've lost that knowledge and now are having to have got sold the line of industrial farming, yeah.
But certain laws like prohibiting urban agriculture, having poultry or a certain amount of poultry or other animals.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it. What else? Uh-huh.
I feel it's the government regulations.
You think it's the government regulations?
Well, starting now, especially, this Food and Drug Administration can get their hand in the way you regulate farm invasions and themselves.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Right. Yeah, mixing animals in with, that's a good point. That's a good point. There's specific regulation in the U.S.
Garden, I said, well, most people ain't, like you said, you got an acre or two of this.
Right, yeah, U.S. government regulations are focused around industrial farming and monocrop farming. That's so true. And that was an explicit thing. It was a specific line of the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, right after World War II, right, when all the tank factories got turned to tractor factories and when all the war chemical factories got turned to agricultural factories, that exact thing happened, right? The USDA said, get big or get out. That was the famous thing, and they implemented a whole array of policies and incentives and subsidies to support large farmers and explicitly put small farmers out of business. That's right, and that's part of it, yeah. So the other thing is that small-scale agroecological farming is something that's based in labor-intensive systems, right? Now, another word for labor-intensive is job creating, right? But it's a different type of job than what our society has determined in its narrative is the good kind of job. Because in the United States, for instance, isn't there this underlying narrative that farming and hand labor is for stupid people? Yes. Isn't that true? Yeah. And we're doing a lot to recover that. Like we're making farming sexy again. That should actually be the byline of CFSA, right? Making farming sexy again. We are, but farming has to be something that's attractive to young people, that's exciting, that's culturally interesting, right? And it isn't perceived like that in the US still in the mainstream at all because it's been turned into a giant, boring, machine-based thing with farmers farming 10,000 acres in Iowa with computerized tractors. Who wants to do that? So this is a place where the economic and cultural dimensions become very visible, right? Where how do you continue knowledge-intensive agroecological farming methods that literally take many years to learn because they are knowledge-intensive. Eco-mimicry is a sophisticated thing. It's not just learning how to do cropping potatoes, monocrop one variety with a tractor. It's like lots of knowledge and skills, right? How do you get people involved in that and intergenerational transfer of knowledge? when you're in a culture that says that farming is for stupid people and something to get away from and to go to cities to get high-paying jobs, which is kind of the narrative in the United States, the unspoken narrative. And so this begins to really make it clear how permaculture is as much a cultural and economic process as a physical process, right? It's about growing a culture of loving this type of living and of actually valuing it as an important thing for humans to do, and of organizing our whole calendar of community activity around that type of cycle, right? And also of changing our economic expectations. Because no, I don't believe we're ever gonna be making money like we do at professional or academic jobs doing small-scale agroecological farming. If one person does it, that's an exception, because the economy isn't in place for it for everyone else, because it's an inherently distributive form of economics. It's about self-reliance at a community scale with a little bit of income for the things that are needed, right? But it's not about a cash economy, actually. And so what this points out to us is perhaps an unwelcome lesson that actually the entire cash economy focus that we have in global society, global economy, is not a sustainable one. What it does is it creates a dynamic that forces people to participate in a type of economy which sets up an agriculture like we have, which is a failing strategy for human survival. Our global economy is a failing strategy for human survival. And so what this says is like we actually have to transform our economy and transform the way we think about income, the way we think about the meaning of human activity and human well-being, to be something that is not focused in the way that the current global economy is. The only way that our current global economy can work is with industrial farming. That's the only way you feed a bunch of people who are not involved in hands-on farming, right? We have to get many millions of people back out into the landscape farming, doing labor-intensive, small-scale agroecological farming to have a truly sustainable land use pattern on the planet. Yeah.
I think that it also, beyond the economics, has a lot to do with the fact that we are spoiled and it's this culture of convenience and instant gratification, which I think for a lot of people, they view this as like the polar opposite of that. And so because we're so used to that, it goes beyond the money making and, that farmers are maybe stupid, and it's just like, I want this immediately, and I want a tomato in the middle of winter, and I can go get it.
Yeah.
So why should I do this?
Right.
I can go to the grocery store.
Totally. All right, and then I'll add this one to the evidence in support of this stuff. So this is this fascinating study that came out in 2014 by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. It's this big group of systems analysts who from around the world who are all involved in climate science. And their question was, how is climate change going to affect agriculture? And what they did is they used all the best models, computer models of climate change, and they created 9 different likely climate change scenarios. They said, look, there's way too much uncertainty. We can't predict any one way that it's going to happen, but we feel very confident that it's going to be one of these 9 scenarios or some hybrid thereof. And so they cast out these 9 different scenarios, and then they looked through all the agricultural regions on the planet and lay out in this study how each scenario will affect each agricultural region. It's a really detailed and amazing piece of research. And it's really technical too. And I did read the whole thing and I was like, blah. But the take home for me was this. What they said in the conclusion is each of these scenarios is going to require radically different adaptation from what our current agricultural infrastructure is. For instance, in 3 of the 9 scenarios, the Southern Appalachians becomes a desert by 2050. If you can imagine the Southern Appalachians being a desert, getting less than 15 inches of rain a year, that's much different than what we have right now. Yeah, and that would require massive infrastructure adaptation to even attempt to continue to farm like that, right? But that's only 3 of the 9 scenarios. It also could not turn into a desert. And a lot of it depends on what happens in the next 20 years globally, right? And how we act, what choices we make. And so how do you then adapt infrastructure and respond at a societal scale with so much different possible futures, right? So many different possible futures. And what they didn't make this final dot connection, so I'm making it. The final dot connection is there is no way for industrial farming to anticipate future climate scenarios and make the right choices to spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing giant irrigation canals and all this kind of stuff. There is no way. The only way to be flexible and adaptive enough to respond to what climate change actually does is through small-scale agroecological farming. Because small-scale agroecological farmers can do all kinds of adapting in the short and mid-term because we're not reliant on giant, costly infrastructure at a government scale. We're reliant on biological systems, working with animals and plants and community scale endeavors, and we can adapt at a micro level with a grain of attention that no governmental or global scale institution can do. See what I'm saying? So the only way to be adaptive for an uncertain future is through small scale design. That's what I'm proposing. And this just really drove it home too, is like the fact that they studied the impact of climate change on agriculture in particular, and it's like, whew, by the way, all of Mexico, Central America, and all 9 scenarios, all those places go vastly down in agricultural productivity because it gets so hot there that plants have trouble photosynthesizing. All right. How about we take a 5-minute break right now?